Hi everyone, let's continue our exploration of Azure Infrastructure as a Service with probably one of the most exciting topics of IT, Azure Backup and Disaster Recovery. This is Arno at Microsoft. I'm a cloud solution architect, and let's review the technologies that are here present for you in cloud. So we will review in this session basically the different options that are available for you to do backup in your public cloud or in a hybrid cloud. So basically, how do you add the backup capability in your on-premise already existing environment? That's one of the very easiest and most compelling scenario. When you start with cloud, very easy to do that. We will then spend some time to understand how to build a disaster recovery plan in the cloud for your data center. Same thing, DRP is usually very overlooked. Now with cloud we have a very interesting and compelling value proposition story that you can have with Azure Site Recovery. And then we're going to spend some time reviewing the possibility that you can use in Azure to make a virtual machine highly available and able to restart into a different region based on the infrastructure architecture. So let's go and let's start with the backup. So basically Azure Backup offers a very easy way to deploy a reliable offsite data protection, right? We know with backup, ideally what we want is to have backup on tape. Tape, why? Because it's cheap, and then you take the tape to an offsite location, right? So that you are able to restore even though there's a disaster happening on site. Well, I think it's quite safe to say that nobody loves tape really, right? Because we know it's hard to manipulate, it's costly to manipulate and to take from one side to the other. So the very easy solution that we have with Azure Backup is taking those backup offsite very easily. So we have different possibilities here that we can use for backups, either using Azure Backup Server, Data Protection Manager, or just a very small agent that you deploy on server. Those are the guys that can directly address Azure Storage to store your backup. So this is really the dream architecture for backup that we're having, right, with Azure. You don't want to care about infrastructure. And the boring discussion, let's be frank, about backup is usually the storage discussion, right? How do I size the backup correctly with the right amount of storage, of hot storage on hard disk drive and the cold storage on tape storage? And this is quite the boring stuff, manipulating that, so creating with a different kind of storage, basically cluster, the tape robot to manipulate the tape. It's quite boring. So what we care with Azure is basically you don't have to have this discussion. You just focus on the application, focus on the redundancy of the data, focus on the strategy to retain the data, not the hardware, not the consideration around hard disk drive, because the storage capability is there, and you have different tiers of storage that you can leverage based on your needs. So if you want to have storage which is very cheap for very long-term data conservation, then that's cool, we have archive storage. If you want to have faster access to the storage, we have Azure Cool Storage. And if you want to have fast and immediate access to the data, you just can leverage blob storage without any further consideration. And basically very easy to deploy, so you can use backup extension from an environment and use Azure Backup Service from your on-prem environment, whether it's an enterprise workload that you're backing up or just individual servers that you're backing up. And basically you are using all the data plane that we mentioned around storing, and you're using all the management planes, so all the authentication, policy management, access control, basically relying on other technology on Azure that we mentioned in the previous modules. Protecting hybrid cloud workloads, that's the first aspect and a very easy value added that you can do for Azure. So hybrid deployment model, what can you add in your data center capacity to rely on Azure storage? Well, you have two options. The very first one, an easier one, is called MARS. So it's Microsoft Azure Backup Agent, and it's usually just like as Windows Backup Agent that you deploy on your server. It's just a very small piece of software that you deploy on your servers, and you are able to basically back up system state of your server and file present on a server, and directly from the server you upload the data to Azure storage. So very easy, much more related to as actually branch offices or small sites. Because when it's about enterprise kind of workloads, you very much want to have a centralized solution. And this centralized solution can be either DPM from System Center, or it can either be Azure Backup Server, which is the free version of DPM dedicated to Azure. And the advantage of that solution is you can do the backup of not only just system state and files that are present on a file system, but also it's application-aware backup for all Microsoft stack. So you can basically define backups for your SQL Server, for Exchange Mailbox, for your SharePoint site collection. And all of that is with a very deep granularity on different objects that you want to save. But also this guy can do backup of physical machines, of Hyper-V virtual machine, and even VMware virtual machines. So that's the advantage of that Azure Backup Server of DPM. You're doing the backup of all of those elements up to every 15 minutes. So it's a very granular kind of backup that you have, and you are storing all the backups locally on the backup server using software-defined storage. If you want to leverage that, it's a very cheap way to leverage storage in System Center 2016, which is basically present on Azure Backup Server v2. You just put a bunch of disk, and Azure Backup Server or DPM will basically manage the storage for you, manage the deduplication of the data locally to optimize the capacity. And then that will be this guy, and that will be allowing you to manage the long-term retention of the data by uploading to the appropriate type of storage inside Azure to consolidate and keep data for longer, as we mentioned. So that's the overview of what we can do in terms of hybrid deployment models. Now, as we mentioned, for very small components, you can use basically the Azure Backup agent. So you install that individually on Windows Server, you pair it with your basically Azure storage account, and then that's a very direct one-on-one relationship that exists with the server and with your Azure environment. So basically, as you mentioned, this guy can do files or can do basically system state. So system state basically is useful for Active Directory, for IIS. It includes the system registry, the cluster service info, the certificate service information, the IIS database. That's the kind of backup that you can have, and you can do that directly to the cloud. So that's the very simple solution. Now, as you mentioned, Azure Backup Server will work the same way. You will create your Azure Backup Server or your DPM. You will associate that with your storage account in Azure, and then you are able to leverage your storage account there. Now let's review a little bit of a demo on how you put that at work in a hybrid cloud mode. Okay, so let's get started with our exploration of Azure Backup Services. So we are now in this RV recovery vault for this demo. We're going to get to the backup getting started item, and when we want to start a backup, basically it's going to ask us what do we want to backup. So let's get there and see. The first question is actually, what do you want to backup? Is it something on premises or is it something on Azure? Here we see that if we select file and folder or system state, we can actually rely on just Azure Backup Agent. So you download the component and you install this and associate this with the vault, following the steps on the screen, and this is how it looks like. So when you install it, it enables you to do the backup, so you can do schedule backup after registration of the server, of course, and then it gets the backup policy. You specify what items do you want to copy. So here it's just actually a Windows client that I use. So I'm just backing up two random folder for this very quick example. Then we select how do we want to do the backup. So we can do up to 3 backups daily, or we can choose weekly frequency as well. We validate the retention period that we want. So here we can have a daily
retention policy, weekly retention policy, monthly and yearly retention policy. So let's tune it a little bit for this demo, and we can then basically do the transmission of all over the data over the cable, or we can enable to do the offline backup, so transmitting everything on a hard disk drive if it's a massive amount of data might be very useful. So first is creating the backup schedule, enabling everything on the system, and then you can trigger a backup now to verify that everything works correctly, and it will basically do the backup locally first and then transmitted the data over the cable to consolidate that into the Azure storage infrastructure. So preparing storage, and here we go, job complete. It's quite a fast task. So that's what we can do in terms of Azure backup. If we go now back to the Azure console, we can see in the backup items that we have different elements that are in the vault. So you choose here backup agent, and you see that there are actually two laptops, one I used previously and one I use currently. So if we see to the previous one, we can see all the history in files. So I have more than 81 recovery point that is into this environment. So this is the quickest option to do backup and to leverage Azure backup services. You can also do a quick view on the whole environment. You can link your backup environment to Power BI so that you can have a very deep review on what's happening into the environment. So that's for the backup on the client side. Now let's jump to the server side. So again, here we're going to create a backup infrastructure for something on-premise, and we specify that now we want to do backup of additional stuff like Hyper-V, VM, SQL Server, SharePoint, and Exchange, and even the bare metal recovery of a server. Now you can see that this is a different infrastructure that we need to deploy, and we can either use System Center Data Protection Manager or install Azure Backup Server, which is free to use Azure Backup Storage. So I deploy that for you, and we can go to this virtual machine, which is on-prem. It has already been registered to my Azure storage, as you can see here, the registration and the subscription management. You can see the local storage, and you can see the online storage. And you have a couple of servers that are here present in my environment. We deployed the agent previously. So let's now go basically go fast and enable protection for new group of servers. So that's what we have, new protection. We specify that this is something that is regarding servers. Here we can list all the machines in my environment, like SQL Server. So here we see really at the database level the DBs that are installed on my server. I can enable as well the system state and the bare metal recovery for the server, and I can choose any other components that are supported. So for instance, Hyper-V VM, I can select it, or I can select the Hyper-V host component to restore the Hyper-V environment. So here I'm just doing SQL backup into this demo, so I will just select SQL, and I will do backup on disk and backup on premises. Backup on premises and backup in the cloud. So then you specify what is the retention range that you want to keep the data, and when do you want to have the full backup schedule. So here 2 a.m. sounds like a good idea, and then the synchronization frequency is every 15 minutes. So that's the interim for the permanent backup. You can see the evaluation by the system of the storage it will take locally. And then it will say, hey, do you want to do the backup over the cable right now, or do you want to do it later? And what is the integrity that you want to check? Also, you define that you want to store all the database in the cloud, and what is the backup here frequency that you want to have. So we can have 2 daily consolidation in the cloud. So here I'll just take one at 3 a.m. And then same thing than previously for the agent. We specify what is the retention policy that we want to have for the data in terms of weekly, monthly, or yearly retention. We validate that. We can do pre-populating as well on a hard disk drive, or we can transmit everything over the wire. So here that's what we do, selecting all the components, all the databases in the system, configuration, and we create a group. So it of course takes a little while to create the storage structure on the server to get the short-term storage, and then it creates as well the groups inside Azure. So if we fast forward that a little bit, then we can go to our Azure configuration, and we go back to the environment, and we're able to see here Azure Backup Server, and we see things that we saved in our environment. So we can see the system state for my domain controller, and we can see the Docker virtual machine on Hyper-V that I backed up previously as well. That's how it looks like into my very quick demo and test environment for this Azure backup. This time, enterprise class kind of backup. Now let's move to the cloud. So let's check at our Azure console. And now I want to back up basically a virtual machine which is running on Azure. So I'll go to the ASR demo 2016 VM. We can select the recovery vault. That's the same that I used previously, and we can determine a backup policy. So here it's going to list my backup policies that I've defined previously. I select one, for instance, the default one, backup daily at 5 a.m. and keep the backup for 1 month. You do that, and actually the magic of it is going to deploy the backup extension on the Azure VM, or deploy all the infrastructure prerequisites, let's say. And then the backup will happen automatically based on the schedule that has been defined. If we look at an already existing machine, here we can see that this RNO VM, we have a couple of restore points available, and we can trigger basically a backup now. We can trigger the restore of a VM or the file level recovery. So let's take the example of file recovery, and for file recovery we'll basically install agent and script to mount the data, and we select which data we want to mount, and then you will be able to access the content of the disk and restore the file that you want. You can also do the full restore of the VM, and this restore, well, basically you will select the same thing, which application consistent or crash consistent restore you want to have. You validate, and you choose basically, do you want to create a new virtual machine, or do you want to restore the disks of basically the virtual machine that you are running in production. Here I want to create a new VM, so I specify the name of this new virtual machine, specify which resource group we're going to put it in, then specify the staging location for the data, and then we will be able to have the VM eventually, after a couple of minutes, available, and we can have the data test to test the recovery process. Now if we go back to the service recovery vault, and we're going to explore a little bit the content of the backup policies, we can see that we define here the new policy simply by clicking add and defining a new set of criteria for an environment. So here we can see that my hourly log backup is not in use currently. I can create a new one for my new Azure virtual machines. And this will be very similar to what we've seen on the server side previously. So we create the default policy. We create a daily backup at this time. We're going to pick 2 a.m. in Singapore time because I'm running my environment in Singapore time zone. We select for how many days I will keep the daily backups, and then do I want to have a retention policy, so weekly retention policy, monthly backup policy, and yearly. So here probably I don't need yearly backup for this machine, so I enable that, and then the next time I'm going to use a VM applying this policy, well, automatically the data, the sizing will be done for me, so no need to worry about the underlying storage infrastructure. So that's it for the very quick overview of all the backup options that we have inside Microsoft Azure for pure cloud virtual machine, pure cloud workloads, or for hybrid cloud environments.
So now that we see how do you protect workloads that are present on your data center and use Azure Storage to protect them, let's review how you protect workloads that are present on Azure already. So basically you have backup solutions for IaaS VM. So it's basically a backup agent which is present on all VMs that you can choose to enable. So it's a fabric level operation. So under the hood is a snapshot that you trigger from the virtual machines running on Azure. It supports Windows and Linux. It's application aware. So if you're using Windows, it's VSS aware. So it means that you will trigger, for instance, SQL Server VSS agent. So you do an application aware kind of backup. So the full data is backed up even though the database file is open. And we have the same technology present for Linux, and it allows you to do item level recovery. So if we look at the Linux application consistent backup, for instance, it's quite a new technology. So you basically decide to do a backup configuration of a backup. Then you define a pre-backup script and a post-backup script. And so when you are doing the backup operation, basically those operations will be triggered. So you'll be doing special instructions to your MySQL deployment, for instance, pre-backup execution to run the application aware operations for MySQL. Then you do the backup, and then you do your post-operation script to restore, for instance, the full operational state of the environment. And then basically the backup operation happens. So you do the VM snapshot and you do the incremental backup, which is saved in the Azure storage, in the storage vault. So it allows you to have basically this application consistent backup and not just a blind snapshot of the file system. Very important when you are basically running database workloads inside Azure. This is what the interface looks like in terms of defining the retention policy. So as we can see, we can do the retention for daily backups, monthly and weekly retention, and as well as yearly backups. So we can go basically up to 99 years of backup retention. So hopefully we'd all be retired after 99 years. Very important aspect in terms of file recovery. As I mentioned, it's a new feature that you can leverage for both Windows and Linux. So put you here the instructions for that. So basically you select the recovery point that you need, you select the mount point where you want to put the files and the recovery volumes, then you browse and restore the files that you need, and then you unmount the volume, and here you go. A very important aspect, when we're talking about backup, customers and partners are usually saying, okay, this is very good, but the initial seeding of my environment might be very, very big. You have servers, it's quite common that we have servers with hundreds and hundreds of gigs. So what happens for the first synchronization, right? It might take a lot of time if you don't have high bandwidth. So we have the possibility to do offline seeding of this backup. So what happens is you prepare a hard disk drive up to 10 TB per drive. You prepare this disk with BitLocker. We provide you with the toolset to do that. You do the backup. You basically do the backup on the hard disk drive. Then you ship the backup to an Azure affiliated location. Then basically the hard disk drive is plugged, is automatically transferred to your storage account, and then the foundation for the backup is already there. So then what happens is in the subsequent backup, when they will happen, you will only transfer over the cable the difference, the delta backup. So of course you're saving a lot of bandwidth and a lot of transfer times when you're doing that. So there's very commonly used solutions called Azure Import-Export Services, and actually it even works both ways. Another solution when you have more than 100 terabytes of data, we have a new service called Azure Data Box. And Azure Data Box is basically a server that we ship to your data center, and you are using multiple file and block protocols to have access to it. You fill it, and once it's full, you ship it back to us, and same thing will happen. Everything is of course ciphered and encrypted, and when we receive it, the data will be transferred to your storage account, then the data will become available for you, and then you will be basically having access to your Delta backup over the wire. The advantage of that is, Of course, as I mentioned, you don't have to do the procuring of the disk, managing the disk sending and disk return. That's just a full box, having a huge amount of data that you can basically interact with us and send data to. Good thing that we want to have as well is having backups. Backup reports is very important, so you can use basically different tools for using that. You can even have probably the sexiest backup report you ever have with Power BI. You can have a very deep view of what's happening on your backup infrastructure, and of course this would be basically using either the on-prem backup or the VM backup for Azure VMs. Backup monitoring with log analytics, that's also another version to have the view on the backup solutions that you have deployed. Now let's have a view on Azure Backup Agent and Server and see how it works. So we see this demo of Azure Backup and Server. These are great example of software that use Azure storage possibilities. We mentioned about archive, cool, and hot storage, but those are not the only solutions. And if your companies prefer to use Commvault or Veritas or whatever solution, then we're very happy to serve you with that. So you can find directly the solutions in the marketplace and integrate that to do the backup of your existing solution. Same thing, those solutions, NetBackup or Commvault that you might have already onto your on-prem environment, you can use them into a hybrid mode as well. They're running into your environment, you're doing your short-term retention on premises, and you can use basically the cloud connector to upload the longer-term retention inside Azure Data Center. So a lot of possibilities here. Just what matters most is doing backups and taking benefit of the cloud economics basically. Let's now switch to another very interesting aspect of IT life, which is basically disaster recovery and disaster recovery plans. So this is a discipline of IT that is quite ignored, because basically it's putting you in a different, it's kind of a difficult situation, right? You have to go to your management and explain that you're going to basically buy hardware and spend time on an infrastructure that you hope you will never have to use. So it's as well a very difficult mindset to put you in, right? You have to put in your mindset where, oh my God, nothing works, so I need to do the basically all the possibility and all the scenario to recover from a non-working environment. So basically that's quite the reality of the field is that very few workloads in customers' environment are covered by a disaster recovery plan. So this is a very overlooked aspect, and we can offer a solution with Azure. Cloud economics naturally apply here. Consumption based, you only pay when you use it, and you only pay for the virtual machine when you use it. So that's a very fundamental aspect. So what are the important aspects to consider when you're in a disaster recovery plan? Well, RPO and RTO are two very fundamental items that we want to consider. We have the recovery point objective and the recovery time objective, each of them being on the side of an incident. So let's say you have a major incident happening into your production environment. What we call the RPO, the recovery point objective, is the amount of time that you accept to lose of data, because basically you say, okay, 5 minutes is the acceptable or the affordable amount of data that it's okay to lose to restart the production. And on the other side of the incident is called the RT, or the recovery time objective, which is the time for which a minimal set of the production will restart. So let's say we are having now a problem in the production, and I am able to restart maybe not fully the environment, but a subset of the environment after a couple of minutes, couple of hours. And of course, the smaller this amount is, and the more expensive the solution would be usually. So let's review the solution that we have in Azure to help you there. So we have a technology called Azure Site Recovery, and Azure Site Recovery offers you the possibility to replicate workloads that are present into your data center. So very simple here. You have virtual machines. Those machines might be running on Hyper-V. They might be running on VMware. They might be orchestrated by vCenter. They might be orchestrated by System Center Virtual Machine Manager. They might even be physical server, bare metal servers. They might be Windows. They might be Linux. Then the whole idea is we can replicate those virtual machines as they run, and they can be stored inside Azure. And the good part of that is you only pay monthly for a nominal fee for this machine to be replicated, and you pay for the storage in the cloud, but you don't pay in usual time for the virtual machine because it's not a virtual machine. So it's actually a very low cost that you are enabling a disaster recovery plan. So how does it work? Basically, the way you're going to deploy this technology is you're going to deploy on your Hyper-V server a small agent that would be the Azure Recovery Services agent, and that would be replicating over the internet using port 443, HTTPS, encrypted of course, and it will be replicated the virtual machine content. So here, it's actually based on Hyper-V Replica, a technology which is present in Hyper-V since Windows Server 2012. And it's just put at work with that. So this can be done by Hyper-V, and this can be orchestrated by System Center Virtual Machine Manager. It's actually the same underlying technology, same data channel. It can be basically using the public internet or the express route with public peering. So basically, those are the main options that we have. Now, if you're using VMware or if you are running physical servers, you can basically do that as well. So we will need to deploy some components on premises in your data center. So it's actually a mix of what we call a config server and a process server, all packaged together into a unified setup. And actually what this guy do is it will discuss with your vCenter infrastructure or directly with your physical servers, install the replication agent on those resources, and then replicate either the VM or the physical server after local consolidation, transmit that to the Azure storage account, and same thing, you only pay for the storage and the nominal replication fee on this environment. Same thing, we're using the public internet or an express route public peering for this environment. It's comprehensive disaster recovery solution for VMware and physical. So if it's physical, then you can basically replicate all of these workloads that we see here in the table. If it's VMware, you can be adapted with vCenter and vSphere 5.5, 6 and 6.5. In terms of a guest OS, it can be basically anything that Azure supports, so Windows Server 2008 R2, SP1, then up to Windows Server 2016, and of course it's including a very commonly available Linux OS distribution, so it can be RHEL, CentOS, Ubuntu, Debian, SUSE, and Oracle Enterprise Linux. It can be using any type of storage as long as the data disk does not exceed 4 TB. It can use, of course, Azure encrypted storage. You can use managed disk. You can use hybrid Azure hybrid benefits in terms of licensing. It's very easy to put at work. We also have environment planner and Hyper-V for Hyper-V and VMware that allows you to assess an environment and evaluate if you are to build a disaster recovery plan inside Azure, what are your needs in terms of bandwidth and what are your needs in terms of storage. So very great solution to have an overview of what is the RPO that I want to meet and is this realistic? Because ultimately, you know, we can replicate things on Azure with a very small RPO, but the discussion would be, is the bandwidth available for me to transmit the data on Azure fast enough to keep with my RPO objective of 2-10 minutes? then this thing allows you to very much understand if it's any realistic. Of course, what we want to do as well is doing a centralized monitoring and alerting, verifying that the machines are still replicating to Azure, verifying that there is the problem for your disaster recovery environment. That's very fundamental. And as well, very important aspect, as we mentioned, you pay for the disaster recovery solution monthly, just the replication fee plus the basically storage. Now when you want to test your disaster recovery, we will offer the possibility to start the VM in two different environments. As we will see in the demo in a couple of minutes, you can basically start the VM that you replicated into a completely different environment, a test environment that is just a sandbox that you want to use. And then you will pay for the compute for the VM, right? Because that's quite legitimate. Other option is you do a fully controlled disaster recovery, so that's what we call the planned or unplanned disaster recovery. But this is like the real disaster recovery. It's not anymore a test. That's the real condition of execution of the disaster recovery. Then, same thing, but this time you have more preparation. You have prepared the integration with your full hybrid solution. So the networking, the virtual network integration, that's the fully planned situation. So talking about that, let's put it at work into our test environment and try to rescue my on-prem workloads inside an Azure environment.
Okay, so let's explore Azure Site Recovery with the recovery services first for a hybrid cloud environment. So we have servers that are running on premises, and we're going to restore them, run them on Microsoft Azure. So you have all the available options. So for VMs on Azure, VMs running under System Center or VMware, or even for physical servers. So for that you need to deploy on-premises one server. This is this guy that we have here, and this will be the guy talking to your vCenter or talking to your physical servers inside your data center, and will act as a basically bridgehead between Azure and your data center for VM replication. And for Hyper-V, what I did for this demo is a very quick example with two Hyper-V servers with the replication agent installed on them, and then I create a quick replication policy that will replicate the VMs basically every 15 minutes, and we will then try to replicate them on-prem. So you see that in terms of capacity we can go as low as 30 seconds and up to 15 minutes. Of course it all matters and all will depend on the available bandwidth for you to transmit the changes that are committed on the virtual machine to the Azure data centers. So let's have a view at that, and let's now go to the environment. So if you go to replicated items, for now there's just a DC01 which is healthy and is being replicated. So we will go to site recovery, replicate application. So we specify here that we're going to take workloads that is on premises, and that is coming from Hyper-V. Now it will list all the virtual machines that are on my environment, and it will list first the configuration that you want to restore it in the cloud. So now is the list of virtual machines. So it's the basically junction between all the VMs that it finds on my two Hyper-V server, and you just select that, okay, you want to replicate SQL 01 into this environment, and regardless of the hypervisor, I don't even know which hypervisor is hosting it, then you're just replicating this guy. So you specify that this is a Windows VM. We have an OS disk and a data disk to replicate. Here it's quite simple configuration. And we verify the replication settings. So here, Hyper-V replication policy every 15 minutes with recovery point retention every 2 hours. So we validate the configuration, and what happened is basically it's going to talk to the hypervisors that are connected to Azure, and then it will trigger the replication. Under the hood, we're using Hyper-V Replica, which has been introduced with Windows Server 2012, except that here the endpoint is an Azure data center. So if we go to hypervisor here, so we see that it's hosted on HA02, and we're going to the replication item and view replication health, then we're able to see that there is that amount of data which has been transited in the last few hours, and there's this amount of data yet to be transmitted. Very good information to have when you evaluate the bandwidth and the capacity planning for the environment. We have tools to help you gather that information and prepare a migration, of course. So if we go to now the health of the environment, we see that DC01 is being replicated and is healthy. This is the crash consistent and application consistent replication, last replication status. And here we can choose what is the items that this machine is going to use in the cloud. So here we choose to map it to the S2V2 machine, and we specify that we're going to use this virtual network and that this will be the network interface card that is going to be used on the machine. So this LAN manager gigabit networking, which was on-prem, now it will become the primary network interface inside Azure, and you will use hybrid usage benefit because you already have, if you have a software assurance, you already have the licenses to run that there. So you validate the configuration, you can see the disk configuration, and you can see that this disk is replicated correctly. It's just one operating system disk into this environment. At the same time, you can see that SQL01 that we did previously is being replicated now. And we see that on this DC01, we can do individual tests on this machine. So we can do test failover, and planned failover. So test failover is the possibility just to run the machine in a totally isolated environment, whereas failover and planned failover are really the execution of the full disaster recovery plan in a planned manner or in the emergency mode, which is the failover. So here we can do a very quick test failover. We select which data point we want to restore and which virtual network we want to restore the virtual machine in. And basically, now we're going to take all the data related to the virtual machine, starting the test failover, so putting all the bits together to recreate a virtual machine and start this virtual machine. Here I fast forward it a little bit because it takes a little bit of time. And if we go to the virtual machine section, now you should be able to see Contoso DC01 test. So here we are. This is our domain controller that was on premises and that is now restored as a VM. You've probably seen that there's no connect button into this environment because by default, site recovery wouldn't create the endpoint, an IP endpoint. It would just restart the VM on the VNet. So if I want to access this environment, I need to create a network security group to protect this VM. So here I will reuse network security group that opens only remote desktop protocol, and then I will give this virtual machine an IP address that it can stand behind so that I will be able to access the console and verify that everything works correctly. So we give the public IP address settings, enable, and we are going to create a new IP address. Of course, in terms of disaster recovery plan, we see that in the session what we want to have is having all of that automated. So if that's something that you need, then we will recommend that you basically create a script with Azure automation, and then when you do the disaster recovery plan is creating the VM, creating the IP endpoint to connect there successfully. But here, this is just a test. This is just to validate how the environment behaves. So let's just connect in a very quick way to the server. And we do everything manually. So using this account, using those credentials, yes, validating the certificate. And if we go to the server, here's the domain controller. So I can go on dsa.msc, the Active Directory user account console. And I am able to see that, yes, I have all my user accounts and my computer accounts for my environment. So this is successful, and I can basically then remove and do the cleanup of the environment if I validate that, okay, DC01 is fine. Now, when we go to this environment, we can also have the possibility to define fully running disaster recovery plan. Because as we mentioned, it's good to restart a VM, but this is far from constituting a full disaster recovery plan. So a recovery plan is actually a set of actions that you take to restart the production. So here, we're going to use this environment to create a disaster recovery plan that includes those two virtual machines. So we just here select OK, validate the scenario. So now it will create for us a recovery plan that includes those two virtual machines. So it's creating the structure for that. And we're going to have a little bit of customization for this DRP here. So we can see that that's the test failover and the cleanup failover and the failover. So that's basically the same thing, but this time it will be composed of two virtual machines that will be executed. So if we go to our disaster recovery plan and if we do customize, so if we do the customization, well, we see that we have those two virtual machines into the plan, but here that's basically the start line of the disaster recovery plan. So we can probably do some modification here, and let's say I want SQL Server to start later, so I'll probably just remove a SQL 01 and create DC01, so the machine will start, and then on top of that I will basically add a manual action. So here I will have a prompt and say verify that DC is okay. Then I have an action instruction, so it means that I will have a pop-up from the user console here that I need to check with Jackie if the domain controller is okay. So this is a manual action that will interrupt the flow of event. Now, what we want to do as well most of the time is create all the scripting operation. So here I do a very stupid and quick example, which is basically opening the remote desktop port, which I put inside the runbook for the automation account. But of course, into real disaster recovery plan, we will always put the script for the Active Directory metadata cleanup and this kind of operation. Here I had my SQL Server as well as a second task. So once I do the first domain controller start and verify that it's running okay, and basically I will start and run SQL Server. So then the SQL VM will restart on a solid foundation. It will be able to locate the domain controller, and it will be able then to run probably in a better shape. So now I can test this failover. So basically all the actions will be executed in a different virtual network, or I can do the basically classic failover or planned failover. So this is the real execution of the disaster recovery plan, or the controlled execution of the disaster recovery plan, so that you're able to prove and execute the DRP in your environment.
All right, so we see in this demonstration a very simple example of replication of workloads, things that are running on premises, and then replicating inside Azure and restarting a VM in my premise inside an Azure virtual machine. So then comes all kind of variations that you want to deploy to best fit your application needs. So if you look at here an example, you could imagine a solution where you're having your Active Directory, your web tier, and your application tier based on the ASR replication. And if you have a very small and simple database topology, let's say one single SQL Server with maybe up to 100 or 200 gigs of storage, then you can use ASR replication as well, and you send the information to Azure Storage and it will be restored as an Azure VM. But as the database is growing, you might want to monitor and you might want to use other techniques to have a finer redundancy in the data, or finer granularity in what you replicate. So actually, when you're having more complicated topology, usually you can leverage both the ASR replication and the AD replication. And it's all about getting a basically different advantages of different mode of hybrid cloud. Let's say if you're doing AD replication and ASR replication, then you are covered with different scenario. If you are doing the ASR replication, then yes, you are able to cover, for instance, corruption inside your Active Directory and restart an Active Directory based on the latest successful replication and non-corrupted state of your Active Directory. But you can use as well AD replication and start using a domain controller inside your Azure deployment. So that really starts to be hybrid. And same thing happens. I mean, as long as we're going to more complicated types of database topology on-prem, so let's say you're having already a SQL Server always on into your environment to replicate one SQL Server to another, let's say, physical location inside your IAC environment, then very likely you won't use ASR replication for that tier. You would just have a SQL Server VM running into a IaaS environment inside Azure, which is linked with your site-to-site VPN, and then you will do the SQL Server replication using SQL Server Always On or log shipping or whatever is your favorite mechanism. And then you would have different layers of granularity and finer granularity and recovery algorithm possible. So this is all the 50 shades of disaster recovery solutions that you can build with ASR. ASR, very importantly, when you are building a disaster recovery plan, it's not about just VMs. It's about the VM plus all the Siemens that come to put the bits come to life together, right? So it's about, yes, starting this VM, but executing this script inside the VM, because usually things are not that easy, right? You need to verify that this service on the VM is running so that you can restart this other service before. You need to do some metadata cleanup. Let's take the example of Active Directory. When you restart a domain controller into a different site, you need to do the metadata cleanup, sizing the FISMA roles, doing all kind of read pool elevation. What you want to do is basically all possible automation. So leveraging Azure automation is a great way to verify that your disaster recovery plan is fully automated, flawless, predictable. Because as you know, right, when you're in a disaster recovery situation, you don't want to start thinking about, oh my god, what's the command again for the metadata cleanup in Active Directory or for the DB restore? No, you want everything to be scripted, everything to be proven to work in a test environment. And that's the possibility. You can test that and test all the automation in a separate and safe environment. So then when the D-Day comes, you are sure that everything would be working as being previously documented and tested. Very important is the application support. Of course, you would expect all Microsoft solutions to be tested and validated by Microsoft product groups, and this is the case. So all product groups at Microsoft validated that their technology worked fine with that, but we also worked with third-party vendors. So we worked with Oracle, we worked with SAP to make sure that SAP workloads restart fine using those technology. So in terms of disaster recovery supported application, and there's an updated version offline, but this is just an overview of the different possibility and the different scenario for site to Azure, whether the application, for instance, Active Directory is relying on Hyper-V, on VMware, or on physical server. It is supported and certified by the workgroup team at Microsoft. So no supportability question. It is end-to-end supported, and it's all actionable. So that's the very interesting kind of situation that we can build here under technology. Now comes with the cloud solution. So you are deploying solutions in Microsoft Azure. Those solutions are highly available, but still you want to have a disaster recovery plan, a plan B, and the possibility to restart your workloads in another data center. So let's say you're using Azure in Singapore, in Southeast Asia data center, where you have your virtual machine using Azure load balancing, using highly available topology based on availability set, as we discussed previously. But still you want to have the possibility, in case of anything happening, to restore the environment into East Asia, into Hong Kong region. Then that's the possibility that we offer with Azure Site Recovery, what we call A2A, Azure to Azure. So we offer the same thing for Azure, which is the possibility to restart the virtual machine, enable the protection of a running workload being replicated to another data center as it is in production. Offers the same way to do orchestrated recovery plans, so scripted and all the automation and all the execution being in Azure. And also offering the failback support. What it means is you're running your workloads, you are running it to a disaster or other data center in Hong Kong, and then once the storm has passed, then you can fail back and let's say host your applications. Same thing with automated technology back to Singapore data center. So that's the experience that you have. You have a virtual machine running inside your data center. You say enable disaster recovery plan. You see here the source data center, and actually it's a region enabled. So here you see that you can leverage all the closest data centers. So from Singapore, you see that I can leverage data center in Hong Kong, but it's not only there. I could also choose South Korea, Japan, or India data center. It's all of that into the different geo and regions inside Azure. Rather than talking about it, let's look at how it works for a virtual machine running in my Azure data center now in Singapore, and let's start to restart that inside Hong Kong.
Alright, so now let's move to the cloud and build a disaster recovery plan for my existing virtual machine. So this machine is run on Azure, and I will create a DRP for this guy. So this guy basically is running right now in Singapore, and I will have the possibility to replicate it to, by default it was East Asia, so Hong Kong. I have the possibility to replicate it to all the data centers in the region, so I can go replicate to Japan West, and then it's going to ask me what are the resource group, the availability set if applicable, the virtual network, storage account, and what are the replication settings that you want to have for this virtual machine. So that's how the experience looks like as we speak. You can enable that directly from the screen. You do enable replication, and of course it takes a little bit of time, so we will fast forward that particular time. And after a while we get the status screen, which we see the different tasks that has been completing. So we've been installing the mobility service inside of the Azure VM, enabling the replication, and then starting the initial replication of the virtual machine from Singapore to the Japan data center. So after a little while, we are able to basically go back to the virtual machine configuration. So we see that ESR demo Windows Server 2016. If we go back to the disaster recovery preview pane, you see that replication is going on. We have a RPO of 23 seconds because there's basically not much changes happening on this VM, so no challenging of getting that replicated to the other data center on the Azure backbone. Now when you go there, you can of course specify as well what is going to be the virtual machine configuration inside the secondary data center. You might want to change that afterward, after the initial configuration. So this is where you would define that into the Azure environment. So you can, of course, switch to the very number of virtual machine and types of virtual machine that are available inside the secondary data center, so inside Japan West here. Once we're done with that, let's say we're happy with the choice of VM that we have in this environment, and we can basically start the test failover. So just as we did it before, now this time we would just say, hey, take this recovery point for this VM, start this VM into that specific demo RG VNet ASR, and restart the VM. So it will be executed. What we do is basically just as on the on-premise environment, we create and instantiate a new virtual machine. You will have here the configuration of the environment, and it will be the same exact behavior and the same exact topology. So you see that we have this type of VM. It has no public IP address. So You guessed it, if I want to communicate directly from the internet to this environment, then same thing than previously. I need to attach a virtual network interface with a public IP address. Then I have the public IP address. I create a network security group. So you can see that it's the same exact concept that we use, and we will use the same automation technique to put multiple machines together, all of this put together with a script that will do the right operation. So that's really the set of technology that we have available to create disaster recovery plan for either a hybrid cloud environment or purely cloud and restarting into another data centers inside Azure.
All right, so another good example of technology that you can leverage for your workloads running this time inside Microsoft Azure data center and restart it somewhere else. So what did we see? We see that backup, we are basically offering technology that are allowing you to backing up your enterprise workloads inside Microsoft Cloud. You want to use Microsoft technology? Fine. You want to use your preferred backup solution? Very fine. Very happy to provide Azure storage to offer the chip storage to do your long-term data retention. Site recovery offers you the possibility to prepare, test, build a disaster recovery plan for your existing environment inside your data center, or as well offering redundancy options for your workloads that are cloud native inside an already existing Azure data center. Hope it was a very nice and enjoyable series of webcasts covering these different technologies of Azure. You can find many customers that are adopted that already on customers.microsoft.com, and we'll put as reference additional in-region scenario and very exciting things that we've seen in the field. Thank you very much for your attention. Q&A is available. We can interact as well directly on Twitter or on my blog. It's been a pleasure being with you. Talk to you soon in an event in person anytime soon.